Hello, everyone. Welcome to this launch event for the Education for CAAFAG technical note. See people joining. And we'll wait a couple of minutes and then we will get started. Great. Good morning, afternoon, and perhaps evening, everyone. My name is Giovanna Vio, and I work as CAAFAG consultant with UNICEF, and I co-lead the CAAFAG task force of the Alliance for Child Protection with Sandra Mignon from PLAN. We're very pleased to have you here today for the launch of the Education for Children Associated with Armed Forces and Armed Groups, or CAAFAG, technical note. So our discussion today will focus on an overview of the technical note, and also a practical example of how integration of child protection and education programs has included former CAAFAG in South Sudan. But before we dive in, I would like to share a few housekeeping notes. So for this event, we're lucky to have interpretation available in French, Spanish, and Arabic. And in order to access the translation in the language of your choice, you can simply click on the language icon at the bottom right of the Zoom option list. It would be great if you could introduce yourselves in the chat so that we know who you are and where you're coming from, what your organization you're working with. And if you have any questions for our two panelists, please use the Q&A function also at the bottom of the Zoom option list. And feel free to write your questions in your preferred language. The last housekeeping note is that after the webinar today, we will continue this discussion on the CAAFAG community of practice, and we will answer there any questions we haven't been able to get to today or other questions that you might have at a later stage. So please do register to the community of practice if you're not a member yet, and we will be sharing the link shortly in the chat. And now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Hani Mansourian, the co-coordinator of the Alliance for Child Protection, who will give some remarks today. Thanks, Hani, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Gio, and welcome everyone again. Glad to be here with all of you guys for the launch of this very important technical note that the CAAFAG task force of the Alliance has pulled together in collaboration with colleagues from education. As we all know, I mean, I assume that a lot of people who are here either work in education or child protection or both. The advantage that these two sectors have in terms of collaborating with each other is the fact that we are both child-focused, child and youth-focused sectors. So there's a very natural coherence across the work that we do, and in terms of the approach that we all have to protection and well-being of children. As many of you know, that still to date, some organizations don't have any distinction between these two sectors. And in the past, for those of us who have some gray hair and have been working for a while, 25 years ago, there was even less distinction between across education and child protection. It was seen as a much more integral and closely knit sectors that contribute to education and protection of children. In my own experience, having worked in many conflict-affected settings and having had the pleasure of speaking to a lot of children who are affected by armed conflict and families and community members that are trying to protect those children, it is very interesting that almost systematically, when you ask children what they need, education comes up, even when they have dire kind of immediate basic needs, including shelter and other things. Education is always at the top of their list, and it's not a coincidence. It's not that we have been telling them that education is important. They see education, when you dig deep in why they bring education up so frequently and so high on their list, you really see that they see education as a much more holistic space and opportunity for themselves, not to just learn in the sense of the cognitive learning, but also to be protected, build a community, be with their peers, and feel safe. So children and their families don't necessarily distinguish education and protection as two distinct elements either. They see it as integral and inherently related with each other. So we need to respect that, and we need to go back to that essence that education and protection bring. And because of that, we have across the Alliance and INE, and Dean will speak to this a bit more, we have had a long-standing collaboration with the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, who is our sister agency within education, or sister network, I would rather say. And this has led to a lot of good collaboration and guidance that has come out, and evidence generation. And this technical note that is being launched is one in that series of material that have been produced out of this collaboration that has been spanning over 5 years now. The technical note, what the technical note says is probably not a surprise to a lot of us, but what it does is that it brings the evidence that we need to make the case, make a strong case of why we need education to be a very strong element of programming for children affected by armed conflict, and particularly children that were formerly associated with armed forces and groups. It lays out the evidence for it, and it gives us a frame to work with. So it almost brings a lot of the knowledge that already existed and a lot of us have been working with into the format of a technical note and a guide that can help us program better, and it almost feels like it's way overdue. I mean, we should have had this a long time ago to help a lot of our colleagues in the field who are doing the day-to-day work of protecting children and educating children to be able to benefit from almost the wisdom that has been collected in this technical note. I want to highlight two elements that stand out to me in this guidance note, and I know there's going to be a presentation of it, so I won't go into too much detail. But what is important for me is that the technical note highlights almost in parallel two tracks in which education can help protect children that are affected by armed conflict and formerly associated with armed forces and groups. One is on the prevention side, and one is on remedying the harm that has already taken place, so more on the response side. And it's interesting that in our work on prevention, when we look at risk factors and protective factors that lead to child protection harm or lack of harm, education again comes up at the top of the list. It's systematically, it's a universal risk factor. If the lack of it is a risk factor, presence of it is a protective factor. Of course, there are areas where schools specifically have been used in the past as recruiting areas, but that's something that we have a solution for. There's a political solution and a programmatic solution, but practically education always comes up as a risk and protective factor in our prevention work. So the technical note really clearly lays out how education has a role to play in both of those areas. And I'll close by basically saying that if children see education and protection as integral and inherently linked with each other, we don't have a choice to not see that. It's an obligation that we have to respond to their needs and make sure that we work across education and child protection to protect children and ensure their well-being. Back to you, Gio.
Thank you very much, Hani. Very important words. And now I would like to introduce and welcome Dean Ross, Director at the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, also known as INE, for some other opening remarks. And we thank you very much, Dean, for coming today. And over to you.
Thank you, Giovanna. Very honored to be here today and just find myself reflecting on the words Hanny just shared, and especially that point on children and youth seeing protection and education is actually integral. And I just want to build on that. I think that is critical for us to be listening to when we think about response. And you know, as INEE, we welcome this guidance note. I just have to say, having read through, was impressed and thinking about how practical and useful this will be for practitioners in specific who are implementing programs. And what really stood out to me was how it makes the case and highlights the significance of not only the collaboration, but the integration of both education and emergencies and child protection. And it's, you know, as Hanny was saying, if young people are asking for this or they see it this way, it's such a critical piece of really working to address the complex needs of children and youth associated with armed forces and armed groups. Just to give you a little bit of a kind of insight, you know, when I was reading through it, it stood out to me that it has good practice highlighted. It's got tools, resources, highlighting the minimum standards for education, highlighting the child protection minimum standards as key resources. But it's also just very practical with ideas and breaking things down into age levels and approaches. The kind of thing that I know, thinking back to my years in various contexts, that you really need, because you're trying to figure out what's best and how to do this in a right way that is meaningful. And having a guidance tool like this, as Hanny said, it's overdue. So very excited to see that this has come about. This point on the silos, and it's something I'm thinking a lot about lately. And you know, child protection and education, of course, we have to work together. Schools have to be safe. We have to be learning from our child protection colleagues. As I was reading through, I was thinking about, you know, inclusive education approaches, how we often look at, you know, in a disability inclusion scenario, we would be looking at individualized education planning and so forth. And that's very much what child protection is doing when they look at case management. And the guide is talking a bit about that and how actually we need to be thinking about these individualized.
Il faut réfléchir un peu plus en approche.
This really goes into the socio-ecological model, holistic response. So really, I would encourage everyone to take the time to read through closely. And really, you know, when we talk about things on the side of education, we have to consider holistic approaches if we're going to be meeting the needs of children and youth in these settings. And that really does mean taking forward the guidance that we'll find in our respective minimum standards. So just to end by saying INE is grateful for this collaboration that's led to this timely and essential guidance. And we look forward to promoting this across INE for our members. You know, the Alliance will do the same. And thank you, everyone, for taking time to join today. So back to you, Giovanna.
Thank you very much, Dean, for these remarks, and apologies for misreading your surname earlier. It's Dean Brooks. Really appreciate it. And now, without further ado, I would like to invite Jessica Oddy, consultant on equity-based education in emergencies and main author of the technical guidance on education for CAAFAG, to share with us some of the key findings. Welcome, Jess, and over to you. You have 20 minutes for this presentation.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk through the education interventions for CAAFAG technical note. I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background and the rationale to this technical note. So as both Dean and Hanny mentioned, for many years, child protection and education in emergencies sectors have been working together. However, there hasn't been perhaps a go-to document that really focuses in on how to provide quality cross-sectoral and gender-sensitive education programs programs specifically for children associated with armed forces and armed groups, and thinking about connecting this both to prevention, but also release and reintegration mechanisms. Although I am the main author of this document, it has really been built through extensive collaboration and input from many people. I know some of you are on the call today who've taken the time to feed into the development of this document. Just to highlight, this has been developed with the CAAFAG task force, and education in CAAFAG programming reference group was also established with representatives from many different organisations. Child protection practitioners have also inputted into this document, as well as education and emergencies practitioners. We also did key informant interviews with 23 education and child protection practitioners who work directly with children associated with armed forces and armed groups, and have experience implementing CAAFAG programming in 14 countries. We interviewed and received fantastic technical input from people working in international non-governmental organisations, national NGOs, community-based organisations, people with former teaching experience, and also government representatives. And although we didn't speak directly to children as part of this technical note, we reviewed many desk studies and programmatic documentation, which included participatory guidance from children associated with armed forces and armed groups. So just to give you a bit of background of where this comes from. If we can move to the next slide, thank you. We also want to highlight that this complements a number of existing tools which are already out there, and we reference within the technical note as well. So last year, the CAAFAG Programme Development Toolkit was launched. This is a fantastic resource with with a lot of guidance and assessments and really practical tools to help practitioners through the whole programme design process of working with CAAFAG. It also complements, and we reference throughout the document, the INEE minimum standards for education and emergencies, as well as the minimum standards for child protection and humanitarian action. And we also take and signpoint a lot of tools and resources from the guidance note on supporting integrated child protection and education humanitarian action, which was launched last year by the Alliance for CPHA and INEE. So if we could just move to the next slide, thank you. As Dean mentioned, one of the things that came through really strongly from the key informant interviews with practitioners working with CAAFAG, there is a real need to take a look at take a socio-ecological approach to really design and develop programs that take into consideration the cross-cutting issues that can impact a young person's ability to participate in and stay in an education program. In the second part of, so the first part of the technical note goes into the kind of key definitions related to CAAFAG and gives an overview of the legal and normative frameworks. The second part of the technical note goes into some of the key considerations, and one of the most critical ones being the socio-ecological model. We recognise that through the case studies, education programming must take this approach to take into account the complex interplays of factors that affect children's reintegration, development and well-being. By taking this approach, again, we really stress the need to recognise the interconnectedness of social, economic and environmental factors that impact children's lives, and therefore need to be considered when designing quality, gender-sensitive, participatory education interventions. And we think as well, it's really important because this model puts children at the centre of the response and really is the kind of creates that anchor for more holistic and integrated responses to meet the needs of all children. And so when we look at the key interventions in part 4, we also provide recommendations for actions or activities that address these different levels of the socio-ecological model. If we can move to the next slide, please. And apologies, there's an issue with the sound. I'm going to move a little closer. Is that any better?
Yes.
Okay, great.
It is. I think so. Thanks, Jess.
Okay, I'll talk a little louder. Thank you for the comments. So yeah, the other consideration that came through really strongly was the need to really understand the individual differences that can support, and understanding this is critical for effective reintegration strategies that address each children's needs, but also the caregivers, and can really help make sure that we are developing appropriate programs which not only enable children and youth to access these programs, but also to stay in and thrive in educational settings. And so from the findings, we identified these kind of key areas that need to be considered, from gender, disabilities, age, different identity markers, such as ethnicity, etc., that can really influence and either prohibit or enable some young people to successfully reintegrate into school settings, or can result in them being excluded. We also found from the key informant interviews that a young person's support system is also really key in enabling young people to stay in education. There was also, again, findings around the length of time that a young person has been associated with an with armed forces or armed groups, and how that also has a knock-on effect in terms of their reintegration back into educational settings. And one of the reasons why later in the key intervention sections we talk about ways to support children from, you know, who've had very diverse experiences within armed groups to reintegrate into school settings. We also found that access to other services is really key, and that's, again, where having a case management approach to educational support is so important, because this is obviously one of the key areas where child protection can really support education colleagues in terms of setting up referral mechanisms and ensuring that young people have access to the services needed that can needed to keep them within schools. And we also found community perceptions as well, and how this varied in different contexts, and obviously has an implication as to whether a young person or child or young person is able to access a school or educational facility. If we could move to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, and as Hani and Dean also mentioned, integration and joint programming, integrated and joint programming is really key. As we know, there has been for many years this extensive collaboration. We within the technical note, we highlight how child protection and education are two pivotal sectors that have a crucial role in facilitating education interventions. And this can be in a number of ways, whether it's through programmatic collaboration, but also on a coordination level as well. And thinking about the need for more opportunities for interagency coordination. So the slide highlights some really practical ways of doing this. This is from the Alliance for CPHA and INEE's jointly developed guidance note on supporting integrated child protection and education and humanitarian action. We also found through some of the case studies that there were examples of multi-sectrol interagency coordination, specifically relating to CAAFAG, the establishment of CAAFAG task force at a national level that could really help support the needs of children and youth and families. And we provide practical examples of that within the technical note. If we could move to the next slide. So part four of the technical note delves into the key interventions. And again, these are the key interventions that have been that are based on the findings from the key informant interviews and the desk research. And as Hani mentioned, there isn't, perhaps some of these interventions are not going to be kind of groundbreaking if you work in child protection and education in emergencies. But what we did find were key, clear examples of how organizations were working to design and implement holistic programming that included these different areas. And for working with CAAFAG specifically, these are the types of these are the key interventions that we think education programs, or we found education programs should include. And so mental health, psychosocial support and well-being were critical. And for those of us working in education, we know that MHPSS and well-being are really key to learning and essential for kind of academic attainment and transition. And we also know from the studies and the interviews that many children formerly associated with armed forces and armed groups would have experienced adverse childhood experiences, so would have, experienced some many different types of adverse experiences, and not necessarily discuss these, would be open to discussing these in a school setting. At the same time, we also know that many children who are formerly associated with armed forces and armed groups are not always identifiable in school settings. So there is a real need to obviously mainstream some of these types of support. We recognise that MHPSS in schools is multi-layered, it is a multi-pronged approach. The pyramid and case study on the screen is taken from the INE guidance note on psychosocial support, and also the CPMS standard 10 on mental health and psychosocial distress. And it outlines 4 levels of interventions that should be considered, and within the guidance note we provide really targeted activities that can support these at different levels. If we can move to the next slide, please. And just linking to that as well, teachers obviously have a critical role in ensuring a school is welcoming and inclusive, and is able to support MHPSS and well-being. Within the technical note, we highlight some key approaches to do that, and reference and signpost to a wide range of resources and toolkits that are out there that will help you with your programming. One of the things that came through quite strongly was the need to have a trauma responsive educational approach. So this is really thinking about supporting teachers and caseworkers to support some of the potential emotional and behavioural regulation challenges that children associated with armed forces and armed groups may have. And so we provide some practical examples there. We also found that one of the key things that would support teachers to do this is to have more joint and integrated CP, MHPSS and education capacity strengthening initiatives. And while we found a couple of examples of this happening, this is still an area that we feel that could grow significantly. And of course, referral mechanisms as well, and teachers play a key role in identifying children, but also in making sure, working with child protection to make sure they get the specialised support that may be necessary. If we can move to the next slide, please. The other key key stakeholders to work with as well are parents and teachers, and parents and teachers associations can play a really fantastic role in supporting children and their families reintegrate into schools. They can also play a key role in the prevention of recruitment and use by armed forces and armed groups. Again, we identify some key areas and examples of where parents and teachers associations have played pivotal roles, whether that's through facilitating caregiver support programs, identifying opportunities within the community for children and their families to engage with, and also joint and integrated livelihoods programming, which, if you would like to learn more about this, the CAAFAG task force have just released a guidance note around this, which can also help give a kind of greater understanding as to why livelihood support can be so crucial for children and their families, particularly from CAAFAG backgrounds. So I'm just seeing I've got just a couple of minutes left, so we're going to run quickly through the next couple of slides. Yes, the other key point is around curriculum, and I think maybe just just because of time, one of the key things I would just say that this section focuses on is the conflict-sensitive education approach, which really highlights the need for a need to take into account the local context to ensure that that the education that is being provided does not exacerbate any of the underlying issues which could have been potentially the driver for conflict. And the last but not least key intervention focuses on safety in schools. And in this, we look at this from two angles. We look at the prevention of violence en route and in schools, and practical activities that practitioners can take to work with communities in order to minimize this. And we also look at the prevention of school-related gender-based violence in schools and showcase examples of different ways to prevent this, and also to support survivors as well. And so finally, we would like to highlight just a few key recommendations. What has come through so strongly from the key informant interviews, the case studies and the literature is that there is a real need for joint and integrated programming. There is a need for effective coordination mechanisms and multi-sectrol CAAFAG task teams. We really think there's a need to highlight, to take a kind of case management approach to education to meet the specific needs of children, their families and the wider community and stakeholders. And also one of the things that is highlighted throughout this technical note is the need for meaningful participation and ownership of the programs by children, caregivers, communities and wider stakeholders. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Jess, for the very comprehensive presentation and for all your work on the technical note, of course. And may I remind everyone to write your questions for Jess on using the Q&A function. And now I would like to invite to speak our next guest, Harriet Tino, Program Advisor at Plan International in South Sudan, and she will be presenting the Integrated Protection Project on Child Protection and Education for Vulnerable Children. Welcome, Harriet, and over to you. And you have 10 minutes for this presentation. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay, great. Yes. I am going to talk about an integrated project that Plan International has been implementing here in South Sudan. And this project is an education program with integration of CPIE, WASH, and emergency response. And the project is funded by ECHO, DG ECHO. Next slide. Okay, all right. So this program is an integrated response, and particularly it's targeting, conflict-affected, at-risk boys, girls, women in Yei. Yei is one of the locations in South Sudan where we currently have an armed conflict, and there are quite a number of children who are still affected, who are still abducted, and some of them have started returning back to their communities. So this program is providing services to vulnerable children, and CAAFAG is inclusive. Next slide. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the action provides both education interventions, and then we also have a key component on child protection. And as colleagues have mentioned, when we were designing this program, we realized that quite a lot of issues that affect, children or young people from accessing education were intrinsically linked to child protection. And in our engagement with the CAAFAG, we found that many of them wanted to access education. Many of them wanted to reintegrate into their communities. And in the project design, we focus on some of the CAAFAG children, and we had consultative meetings with them. We shared with them to understand some of their needs as children who were affected by armed conflict. Next slide. Now, in designing this program, one of the things that we did was that we conducted a multi-sectrol needs assessment where we wanted to understand some of the key education gaps, child protection gaps that were affecting children, including the CAAFAG. We also had a context analysis, as I have mentioned earlier, that the context that we are operating is still a conflict context, and there are quite a number of things that kept changing over time. So it was quite important for us to understand the context. And then we had a lot of coordination activities that were done. We worked through different clusters, the education cluster, child protection cluster. We also have the mental health and psychosocial support cluster. And we did quite a lot of analysis to understand some of the activities or the interventions that were being implemented to support CAAFAG in those areas. And then we also looked at some of the programs that Plan International was already implementing in Yei. And currently we have another integrated project that is funded by the Swiss Development Corporation and many other programs which were being implemented by different partners. So this particular project was actually aligned to some of those existing projects. And again, something which was of interest when we were designing this program was a participatory approach. Now, this is one of the approaches that Plan International is currently using in designing most of these programs. And we found that this was very relevant, especially when we were talking about CAAFAG. In most cases, our focus looks at the response. How do we support children when they return? But again, when we looked at our programs, we found that there was quite a lot that needed to be understood, especially on how, the challenges that the children were facing, and then also what are some of the reasons, for these children to join the armed forces. So for that reason, we had participatory approach, which were done through consultation with some of the young people themselves. Some of them were actually CAAFAG who were attending our adolescent safe spaces. And then we had a lot of community engagement because we wanted to understand from the parents, we wanted to understand from other stakeholders within the community what were some of the reasons for these children to join or to be abducted. And we also had quite a lot of discussions with the family networks whom we were working with. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry, my minutes are running. So I just wanted to talk about some of the key things that came out of the multi-sectoral needs assessment when we had discussions with the children to understand some of the reasons for joining CAAFAG. And many of these reasons were voluntary and some of them were forced. Unfortunately, about 78% of the young people told us that, you know, they were forced to join armed forces. Some of them were abducted. Then about 12% indicated that because of fear that their parents would be hurt or killed, that made them join the armed forces. And then about 10% said they had joined armed forces because of mistreatment at home. Now, again, when we looked at some of the key barriers for girls and boys to access education, a lot of the reasons that the children were giving us were linked to, you know, issues around protection. So the results or the findings of the multi-sectoral needs assessment is what actually enabled us to come out with a response project which integrated both education in emergencies and child protection in emergencies. Next slide. All right. So one of the key things that we noted from this program was that program integration, where we included child protection, we included psychosocial support in education, greatly contributed to education outcomes. And I think this comes out also very clearly on the technical note, as Jessica has just mentioned. And we found that children, the CAAFAG who were attending some of the education interventions were able to tell us that, you know, they felt that they could reintegrate comfortably because they were learning in an education setting, and then they felt that they can still have hope and be children again. And again, we found that at a school level, it was much easier for us to establish a referral mechanism. And this was set up for both child protection and education as well. And currently in the project, the integrated program that I'm talking about, our child protection activities are integrated within the school environment. For example, we have set up a case management activity within the schools where the caseworkers have a protection help desk within the schools, and children with protection concerns are identified within the school environment. We also have child-friendly spaces that have been integrated within the schools. And we found this was very, very useful, not only for the CAAFAG children, but considering the fact that a lot of children that we are currently supporting are children who are affected by armed conflict in one way or the other. And there were quite a lot of things that we were able to address. Like for the CAAFAG, you know, many of them would also drop out of school simply because, you know, sometimes the schools were not supporting them. Sometimes the teachers didn't really understand the children themselves. But through the child-friendly spaces and adolescent-safe spaces, we were able to, you know, address some of those concerns. Something else that just talked about issues around safety within the school environment. Now, some of our schools, as I speak, are still, you know, occupied by armed forces, and some of the schools, you know, are the same schools where we are expecting the children or the learners to have their education. So this was very difficult, especially for the CAAFAG children, considering the trauma that they have gone through. It was very hard for them to learn. So in this program, we currently develop safe school plans where we map out, you know, some of the risk factors within the schools and then come out with mitigation measures. We've also been doing a lot of teacher training on school-based psychosocial support techniques, on social and emotional learning. And we found that this has been very helpful in helping the teachers to understand how to handle, you know, some of the children or the CAAFAG who might be in the school. And then the other one is also, we've been trying to develop a transitioning pathway, because the project is supporting, primary education through informal and formal education. But when these children complete, they are not able to transition to the next level. So through a joint program, we are able to link them, for them to move to another level of education. And lastly, on referrals, I think the program has, integration of the program has been very useful for us to refer cases. When we have children with protection concerns, it is much easier to refer them for education support. And if there is their children with education issues, it's also much easier to refer them for protection. Sorry, I'm running because of the time. The next slide. Next slide. Again, one of the key things, again, that we've been able to do through the integrated program is engagement with the military wing. And we found that they needed to understand, some of the issues around child protection, child abduction. And through this project, we've been collaborating with enemies that normally organize training programs for military personnel. And through that, we've been able to advocate for military evacuation of schools that are still occupied. We've been able to lobby, for children, CAAFAG to be released as well. Next slide. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Harriet. And sorry to rush you a little bit. We just want to leave some space for questions, but that was very interesting, and I'm sure everybody really enjoyed it. I saw people asking on the chat whether the presentations will be available. They will be available on the CAAFAG community of practice. So if you haven't, if you're not a member, you haven't joined, please do register and you will find them there. So we now have a few minutes for questions. I can see one on the Q&A, and if you haven't posted one and you would like to, we still have a couple of minutes, so please do. Just before you reply, I can see that you're typing, but maybe I'm just going to read it and then you can just respond to Abdikadir. So Abdikadir is asking, what is the recommended duration for CAAFAG children to attend vocational training to acquire skills through reintegration programs? Oh, hang on. Was this the right one? No, actually, I think maybe Jess will ask, we'll let you answer that one, because we thought that it was more appropriate for on the livelihood side. But there was another question on how to offer MHPSS services when social workers are not available due to security reasons. So if you want to reply, and then maybe if Harriet wants to also jump in. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for this question. It's something we go into in the technical note, and I think it's something that Harriet can expand upon as well. Her example, I think, really speaks to this. So in the absence of trained social workers, an important intervention in schools can be non-specialized support. So we're not expecting the teacher to do the work of a social worker, but there are examples of how school education personnel can support former CAAFAG, and maybe that's, for example, having school counselors, peer-to-peer learning approaches, working with the PTAs to support parents and caregivers who may have particular needs, and also the integration of social and emotional learning into the curriculum. These are all examples of non-specialized support. I think, and as Harriet mentioned, she talked a lot about teacher professional development. This came across in many of the case studies as something that is needed, that can really support a teacher to provide that kind of positive classroom management, as well as ensuring that schools, that they're able to support the children. And of course, having referral mechanisms in place to make sure that there is, or to try as much as possible to refer children, youth and their families to that specialized support. But yeah, maybe I'll pass to Harriet, because I know she talked about it briefly, and I know she's got more examples.
Absolutely. Harriet, would you like to jump in and add your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think Jess has already responded, but I think one of the things that we've done is that in our context, by the way, we do not have very many specialized social workers. So currently we are working with community trained volunteers, and these are the people we recruit and train them on, basic PSS methodologies, and they're able to run the activities within the child-friendly spaces. And then for the schools, what we've done is that we are currently using teachers. We've trained teachers to support the learners within the schools. And in some other contexts, we don't have even the teachers. So what we are doing is to use the community structures. And some of these communities, still have some women groups or, some elderly persons, and we've trained them to support the children in those locations. We also found that because of displacement, sometimes it's not very easy for us to access some of the locations at the onset of maybe conflict or whatever. So for those cases, we heavily rely on the community structures that have been trained. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harriet. And thanks, Jess, for reminding us also of the importance of communities always. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. Perhaps I would like to ask a question that we'd come up with Sandra, and there's one for Jess and one for Harriet, just in a couple of minutes. So for Jess, what would you say are the key recommendations for donors when funding education programs for CAAFAG? In a minute. So.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that came out of this study is that I think for education, there's still quite a lot of work to be done, maybe, about raising the issue and importance of CAAFAG programming, and how that has a slightly distinct a distinct angle as opposed to other types of education and emergencies programming. I think one of the key things, and it maybe relates to one of the questions in the chat, is the duration of programming. This is not something, if we want to really make significant shifts and support children who potentially spent years within armed forces and armed groups, a very short-term intervention, education and emergencies intervention, isn't going to do that. So we need to be looking at longer-term programming. I think there also is a need to really highlight that joint and integrated programming, and not just child protection, but also looking at things like livelihood support, looking at things and linking with other sectors, because we know from the socio-ecological model that there are multiple reasons and complex reasons why children and youth can't, even if they can access education, they will not necessarily stay in there without the support. So I think for me, the big thing, or perhaps the next step, is more advocacy work to highlight this to educational donors about the need for this type of programming and integrated programming as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jess. And we have another question for that I'm going to pose to Harriet, from Musa, and he's asking, what are the appropriate strategies and responses for the resilience, for increasing the resilience of CAAFAG or former CAAFAG? Harriet, do you want to answer in a couple of words?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Musa, for that question. I will talk about some of the approaches, not the appropriate one, because it depends on an individual, it depends on the environment. But one of the things that we've been really looking at is a community-led approach, where we think that we need to support the community to ensure that these children are reintegrated and supported. A lot of our programs, looks at reintegration when children or CAAFAG have just returned, and that could be a short-term kind of support, as Jess has said. But again, how do we bring the community on board? We've been having a lot of discussions, on how to ensure that the government is engaged, in supporting the CAAFAG in our communities. And again, that comes a lot with the capacity and the resources that are needed for them. And the other one, as we've already mentioned, is issues around education. Education is a long-term thing for any young person, any child. So some of the things that we've been doing in this project is to ensure that the former CAAFAG are given opportunity to access education, and not only education in a formal setting, but they've also been given some other livelihood opportunities that they can be able, to do something for themselves. We've been running a life-saving intervention, but our thinking now is to think beyond just a life-saving intervention. What can we sustain to ensure that these children reintegrate and live normally within their communities? Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Harriet. And with this very interesting and pertinent answer, I would say that we're at time, and we've reached the end of this webinar. I would like to thank our panelists today, Jess Odi and Harriet Timor, and of course, Hani and Dean as well for their remarks. We would like to kindly ask you, two things. So for those questions that I see popping up now that we're not managing to answer, we're going to be diverting them onto the community of practice. So do come there, and we'll make sure that we will answer those thanks to Jess's and Harriet's support. And then finally, if you could please complete the Zoom poll that our producer is going to share in a second it's going to pop up in the window. And we hope you enjoyed today. And yes, please do share your impressions, and it's very valuable for us. Thank you very much, everyone. You can see that our producer has also copied across the link to the community of practice. So if you're not a member, please do come there. We tend to post anything related to the work of the CAAFAG task force, as well as external events that can be of interest for members. So thank you. I've enjoyed it very much. Thanks, Dean, and thanks everybody, and thanks to the speakers, and bye again. Have a good rest of your day.